Greetings, summoners. So let's talk about the individual scenes, and then I may end up going over to the GM section to go over a little bit about how the session prep works. I don't know. I may save that for another video because I intended to have a video just on making sessions, mostly using this outline, but in my own style, making a session in the way that most makes sense to me and how I like to run SMTX and other games. So the session advice there is very interesting, quite comprehensive. Scene overview, definition, interaction, conclusion, break. Explain what's going on in the scene. The GM declares which PCs and NPCs are present. Absent PCs may join midway. If the GM allows, the GM can designate a central PC as the scene player to take the lead. Specify scene BGM to determine the atmosphere and overall effect of the scene. So the scene BGMs are very, very interesting. But yeah, they're combat scenes, battle scenes, fall under this purview. And I'm really bad about using scenes. I'll treat combat as a whole scene because that interacts with a bunch of rule systems. But outside of that, I tend to be a little more freeform. And there's nothing stopping you whatsoever from running your game like a D&D game, where you start, everyone meets each other for the first time, they hit the ground running, they go investigate, the abandoned hospital or old mine mill, shopping mall, some kind of derelict building that's got ghosts in it, and it's actually demons. You can make a map. You're gonna have to tack on your own rules for making maps and moving on the map, but using something like old school OSR type, like old school essentials D&D, work really well. So let's get back into these scenes. Definition, yeah, scene BGMs. These are very interesting because they're called scene BGMs, but I tend to not think of them as applying to a scene. But when you resolve a scene that has a scene BGM, like let's say the scene is run away, and you successfully run away, you do get XP for running away. So it's important to note, especially for people who are dead set on starting at level 1, which you should never do. You should always start at, I'd say, like, if you're new to the game and your players are worried about getting one shot and blown away and not having a lot of interesting attack skills, because there's not very many non-combat skills, you should probably start at like level 12 to 15. But if you're adamant on starting at level 1, using scene BGMs to have escape scenes and negotiation scenes where XP is awarded for those activities, the players will inevitably level up a few times by the time they reach a combat scene. You may need to take a moment to level people up and then go double check all their skills and stats, and there's a lot, recalculating all your numbers. There's a lot of reasons why maybe you don't want to level up your players a bunch of times when they first make their character. But scene BGMs are a good way to award XP outside of combat. I think that's their primary purpose, besides obviously putting the focus on, hey, you should do this, and then you get XP for doing it. Interaction. GM explains the situation, advancing the story through interactions with the PCs. This is basically just saying, like, hey, this is the back and forth. The GM defines the scene, says, here's where you are, this is what's going on. The players say, I want to push the red button, and the GM then, part of the back and forth, says, all right, you do that, and this is what happens. And the GM says, okay, then the player says, okay, then I duck and take cover from the trap I just activated, and the GM says, okay, make a check, and you know the deal. One sentence, and it's just saying, like, yeah, that's the back and forth. That's the game right there, baby. Conclusion. Scene concludes either when certain conditions are met or at the GM's discretion. The scene player was designated, their exit marks the conclusion of the scene. Kind of normal. Scene players are a bit of a strange concept. You can consider the openings if they're for individual players. If one person is the scene player and they call another player on their cell phone or they go interact with another player, the assumption is that they still have the spotlight until their scene is over, even if they're including other people in their scene. Break. Interval between scenes. Confirm the outcome of the concluded scene. Make sure the players are on the same page before starting the next scene. Managing solo scenes. During the game, there may be times where PCs act separately. In such cases, the GM should aim to keep each scene brief and ensure all PCs have their scenes played out. Again, this is also very similar to the openings. They're meant to be very short, very brief enough to get everyone that initial push into the investigation approach phase of the game. Scenes without PCs. They create and present scenes without PCs as necessary to provide information, align the story, or for other purposes. These are basically just fully descriptive narrations. The trailer falls under this type of scene, although it's not a scene within the game session per se. But yeah, you can have essentially fully cinematic type cutscenes where it's like you see this kind of gets blurry with like the description and definition part of a scene where the GM says, you know, hey, you're in a security room and you see on the cameras this happening. And then the GM basically describes a whole scene. The players aren't present there, they can't interact there, can't do anything. Just for pure descriptive purposes. Separating scenes and times. Yeah, so for the dungeon attack, you definitely want to keep things on a linear scale, where old school philosophies, I suppose, don't apply are outside of the dungeon and combat rounds. Combat rounds in particular, the dungeon could have weird time shenanigans going on, but it's best to keep it strict, as it advises here. But outside of that, if you need to skip days or someone needs to go from morning to afternoon to meet up with someone, like they can just, there's no point in like trying to figure out what happens in those hours or days or whatever. It's just like, hey, I've got an appointment at 6 p.m. and it's the morning time, so I'm just going to wait until I meet with whomever. And then you go to the next person. They see, well, what are you doing during this time? Nothing. It's just like, whatever. In the approach phase, there's more definition about, and I need to get better about structuring that time, but I would normally go in around the table, like here, where each person does their first cycle, then their second cycle. But when I did that most recently, the tracking of time got very strange because one person is like, well, I want to talk to that contact that I was just talking to again. So I went to the island, I left the island to talk to them. And then when that was done, I went back to the island, but now it's my turn again. And I learned new information from my friends who are also on the island. I'm going to leave the island and go ask that guy something again, just assuming that like they have a car, they have to go travel. Because the game's not about like calling people on your cell phone at every chance, because then you would kind of just do that, I feel like. Even though all the NPCs have like detailed, well, not detailed, they have a short blurb about how to physically meet them and talk to them. It's a bit ambiguous about how the GM is supposed to arbitrate that. Or do you just say like, yeah, you can leave and go ask them that, but then like the next question is like, I'm going to go talk to them again, or I'm going to go talk to someone else who's technically on the other side of town. Like, how long does that take? Can I fit that in? That's why separating scenes and time is written here, so to handle situations like that. But it can be tricky for sure, because then everyone still needs to meet back up again, so to speak. Then it describes the units of time. Okay, so let's go to the Game Master section. Game Master. Warm up, cool down. Yeah, so. Yeah, that might have to be a different video because just the Game Master section all on its own, like, this is all good advice for the most part. The warm up here, so this coincides with character creation and presenting the trailer. There's actually a lot more going on here that break the ice and ease everyone into playing the game. Talked about scenarios and gate power in the previous video. Please check that out. But the random encounters, how to choose bosses, decide the drama. So there are effectively 2 pages for creating scenarios. And a scenario is typically meant to be like a one shot. And because SMTX doesn't use combat grids, you don't really need a strong sense of battle map. There's no supposition that you've created a discrete dungeon. It mostly focuses on the story beats and which enemies you include in the session. And that can feel rather trim because there's so many systems like the BGM, scene affinities, and the whole concept of like the approach phases. It's just not very well defined, and it's even less defined in Tokyo Conception, I feel, which is unfortunate, I suppose, because Japanese players really love their pre-made scenarios, but they didn't really make very many for SMTX. They have a lot of scenario ideas, but I think as far as actual written scenarios go, there's like 4 or 5 across all the supplements and magazine articles, because there is one in the magazine article, and I think it's set up like a quick start guide, so it's got the rules and sample characters in the article itself. Yeah, I think I'm going to leave the actual session creation and GM advice for another video. Yeah, the approach phase. So let me just talk about that again. Bum, 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 bum. Deciding the drama, key elements. Okay. Approach phase serves 3 key roles. First is information gathering. This is where PCs gather information, which helps them understand what they need to do during the dungeon attack and allows them to prepare. All very important stuff. This covers things like getting items, discovering weaknesses, which enemies are going to be prevalent, what types of themes. If they're all undead, they're usually undead are weak to fire and expel. Therefore, the GM should design the approach phase in a way that ensures the PCs who act accordingly, which means that they are asking questions that are relevant to the story, they're advancing the story, they're saying, well, what enemies are there? Undead? Oh, okay. Do you think you could lend me a Meraki rock? Sure. Make a conversation check. If you succeed, I'll give you 1. If you crit, I'll give you 3. Whatever. Or just going to a store, spending your maca. I don't know if that counts as a cycle per se, because I tend to put more, and even in the scenario in this book, there's more keywords than there are information gathering cycles, and it's not very well explained how those are intended to be actually processed by the GM, and it's edge cases like that make it really, really tricky to say, like, yeah, you should definitely run the game this way, because there's multiple valid interpretations. I think that's one of Tokita-san's largest downfalls, is that he tends to intentionally leave gaps in the rules and advice in a bid to not tell the GM how they need to run the game. Unfortunately, this has the opposite effect of, well, I don't know what to do, so please tell me. So let's see. Dun, dun, dun. They can obtain important information, boss's weakness, mythological background, objectives. Second is reviewing the rules. Yeah, so I mean, the approach phase is not about reviewing the rules, but you can use the approach phase to drip feed the rules. They offer opportunities to practice game rules. For example, the PCs can fail at information gathering. The GM can trigger random encounters, initiate smaller combat. This is basically like, hey, I found a demon. I'm going to ask him a question. I've offended them. Oops. Now you're going to 1v1 the demon, or maybe even 4v1 the demon. And yeah, someone might get hit. You know, it's a little interesting, a little resource drain. It could also be a waste of time. So, I mean, just be careful about that. But having a little micro exposure to, hey, this is how you roll initiative. This is what a round looks like. You know, don't forget to subtract your defense when you take damage. Third is deepening the story. Yeah, so the primary, I'm surprised I didn't put this one first, but the choosing how to gather information, making a check, presenting that info gathering scene based on results. So yeah, it's like, hey, I want to go to, I want to go visit the fortune teller. Okay, sounds good. Make a check. You roll and you fail. It's like, well, you do learn the basic information. So we're going to play out a scene where, you enter the dark office building and you go past the bead covered doorway and have a seat. The contact, says, take my hands and I'll consult the orb. I'll ponder the orb. Then you just give out that basic information. Then, or, if you crit, then you say, oh, come in, I've been waiting for you. I foresaw your coming and prepared, a generous gift. Here you go. Right. So you're meant to do the check first, then play out the scene, which I think goes against most people want to have like an active pause, right? They say, I want to climb this cliff. So they move their character to the cliff and they say, I want to climb the cliff. They make the climb check, assuming that, you make the check assuming you succeed and you want to get up there, but you fail the roll. So you just stand there and you stop. And then there's like a awkward pause. It's a little weird. I guess climbing something is different than like information that you've gathered, right? But it's a good idea to roll, then describe. Because there's no shortage of people who are like in combat. It's kind of the most common example, right? Where it's like, I charge up to the guy wielding my sword in two hands and I bring it down on them and then they roll. And then they miss and miss. And it's like, you can just roll first and then describe the hit, right? Then it'd be a little less awkward. Typically, the roll is prompted in the moment actively. Not so much here. You can still do it any way you want, but this is the method that's going to work the best, where you make the check, then describe the result. Naturally explore and engage with the story, bring NPCs to conversation. Yeah. Okay, so I think that's enough for this video. Hopefully I shed some light onto the structure itself, why it's set up that way. Next time, I'll probably go over the GM section in more. I may talk about, like conversation. Boom. I may talk about this procedure super fast. Info gathering super fast. Because, this talks about approaches, right? I should have come to this one, but it's only one page. Not super in-depth. But it is relevant to the aspect of designing a scenario as the GM rather than describing the structure of a scenario. Oh, there's a typo here. That's funny, because sometimes when I open the PDF software, for whatever reason, it just has like a random page in active typing mode when I fresh opened it, and you'd assume that nothing is selected in the game, or in the PDF, but sometimes a text frame is just active, and I'm pushing keys trying to get my mouse to unlock, and who knows what it's typing where. That's my own skill issue on that. I haven't really done that much, but I did not know that was there until just now. Anyways, thank you for watching, and as always, please subscribe and like the video. Make sure you leave a comment if there's other aspects of the system that you're interested in me covering that I haven't gotten around to yet. And check the pinned comment for links to the Discord server and the Google Drive. Thank you and goodbye.